November 8, 1942. Before dawn breaks over the coasts of French North Africa, the largest amphibious invasion fleet ever assembled approaches three widely separated landing zones. Over 100,000 American and British troops aboard more than 650 vessels converge on beaches in Morocco and Algeria. In London and Washington, political and military leaders anxiously await news. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler monitors reports with growing alarm. In Vichy, France, conflicted French commanders face impossible decisions about whether to resist their former allies. Operation Torch represents a watershed moment in World War II. It marks America's first major offensive operation against Axis forces. It opens a second front against Germany, relieving pressure on the Soviet Union. It begins the campaign that will drive Axis forces from Africa entirely, and it will reveal fundamental tensions between American and British strategic thinking that will shape Allied operations for the remainder of the war. The operation's complexity is staggering. Troops sailing from the United States and Britain must land simultaneously at Casablanca on Morocco's Atlantic coast, at Oran in Algeria, and at Algiers, 500 miles east along the Mediterranean. They face not German troops but French forces loyal to the Vichy government, creating a political and military quandary. Will the French resist? Will they fight to the death or capitulate quickly? Can diplomatic maneuvering convince them to join the Allies without bloodshed? As landing craft approach the beaches in darkness, no one, not the American soldiers experiencing combat for the first time, not the British veterans watching their inexperienced allies, not the French defenders confused about their orders, not the German high command preparing countermeasures, knows how the next few days will unfold. The fate of North Africa, the future of the Mediterranean theater, and possibly the outcome of the entire war hangs in the balance. The decision to invade North Africa emerged from months of strategic debate between American and British leadership. The arguments reflected fundamental differences in how each nation viewed the path to victory over Nazi Germany. American military planners, led by Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall, favored a direct approach. They advocated for a cross-channel invasion of France in 1943, Operation Roundup, to establish a second front in Western Europe and drive straight toward Germany. This strategy would concentrate Allied power at the decisive point, force Germany to fight on two fronts, and potentially end the war quickly. British leadership, particularly Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Chief of the Imperial General Staff General Alan Brooke, considered a 1943 cross-channel invasion premature and potentially catastrophic. Britain had already been bloodied at Dunkirk and in failed operations elsewhere. They remembered the carnage of World War I's Western Front. They believed Allied forces needed more training, more equipment, and more combat experience before confronting the Wehrmacht in France. Churchill advocated for a peripheral strategy, attacking Germany's soft underbelly through the Mediterranean. North Africa offered several advantages. It would relieve pressure on Egypt and the Suez Canal, threatened by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. It would open Mediterranean shipping lanes, currently dominated by Axis forces. It would provide a springboard for operations against Sicily and Italy. Most importantly, it was achievable in 1942 with existing forces. President Franklin Roosevelt faced political pressures. He had promised Soviet leader Joseph Stalin a second front in 1942. American public opinion demanded action. The United States had been at war since December 1941, but most American forces remained at home training. Roosevelt needed to deploy American troops somewhere, and North Africa represented the only feasible option for 1942. The compromise reached at London conferences in July 1942 produced Operation Torch. It satisfied Roosevelt's need for immediate action, Churchill's strategic preferences, and addressed Soviet demands for pressure on Germany, while postponing the dangerous cross-channel invasion until circumstances were more favorable. The target, French North Africa, presented unique challenges. Since France's defeat in 1940, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia had been governed by Vichy France, the collaborationist regime headquartered in Vichy, France. French forces in North Africa, approximately 125,000 troops, modern aircraft, and naval vessels, answered to Vichy. Their loyalty was uncertain. Would they resist Allied landings? Would they welcome liberation? Or would circumstances determine their response? American planners believed French forces would fight briefly for honor's sake, then surrender. They hoped French military leaders might even welcome Anglo-American forces as liberators. British planners were less optimistic, remembering Britain's attack on the French fleet at Mers el-Kabir in 1940 and subsequent fighting in Syria. French military personnel harbored considerable resentment toward Britain. Planning Operation Torch from scratch in just 4 months represented a monumental achievement. The operation required coordinating forces sailing from the United States and Britain to land simultaneously at 3 locations separated by hundreds of miles, all while maintaining operational security and conducting diplomatic negotiations with potentially hostile French authorities. Command structure reflected political sensitivities. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, relatively junior but politically astute, received overall command, his first major combat command. The appointment of an American commander was deliberate. Planners believed French forces would be more likely to cooperate with Americans than with British forces. Major General George S. Patton would command the Western Task Force landing at Casablanca, sailing directly from the United States. Major General Lloyd Fredendall would command the Center Task Force landing at Oran. British Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson would command the Eastern Task Force landing at Algiers, though American troops would make the initial assault. The Western Task Force faced the longest journey and most exposed position. Sailing from Norfolk, Virginia, and other East Coast ports, Patton's force would cross the Atlantic in a huge convoy, vulnerable to U-boat attack. They would land on Atlantic beaches at Casablanca, facing ocean surf rather than protected Mediterranean waters. The Atlantic coast landing sites offered the advantage of being outside the Mediterranean, preventing the Strait of Gibraltar from becoming a chokepoint, but exposed troops to rougher seas. The Center and Eastern Task Forces would sail through the Strait of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean, a bold move given Axis air and naval dominance in the region. They would land on more protected beaches, but closer to Axis bases in Sicily and Sardinia. Logistics were staggering. The operation required 650 ships, including combat transports, cargo vessels, escorts, and warships. Over 100,000 troops would participate in the initial assault, with hundreds of thousands more to follow. Planners had to calculate fuel requirements, ammunition loads, food supplies, medical facilities, and thousands of other details for an operation occurring thousands of miles from home bases. Training proved challenging. American troops were largely inexperienced. Many had joined the Army only months earlier. They had trained for basic combat but had never participated in amphibious operations. Landing craft were in short supply. Many of those used at Torch would be the same craft used later at Sicily, Italy, and Normandy. Troops practiced amphibious landings on American and British beaches, learning techniques that would be refined throughout the war. Diplomatic efforts paralleled military preparations. American diplomat Robert Murphy conducted secret negotiations with French military leaders in North Africa, trying to determine who might cooperate and under what circumstances. General Henry Giraud, a French officer who had escaped German captivity, was cultivated as a potential leader of French forces who might switch sides. The negotiations were delicate, convoluted, and ultimately only partially successful. Operational security was remarkably effective. Despite involving hundreds of thousands of personnel and massive ship movements, Torch remained secret until forces were nearly at their objectives. The Germans suspected something was planned but couldn't determine where. Some German intelligence suggested an operation against Norway, Others thought Sicily or Sardinia. The truth, a massive invasion of French North Africa caught them largely by surprise. In the early hours of November 8th, three widely separated invasions began simultaneously. Western Task Force Casablanca. General Patton's force approached Morocco's Atlantic coast in darkness. The objectives included three landing sites: Fedala north of Casablanca, Casablanca itself, and Safi south of the city. Heavy surf immediately created problems. Landing craft broached in the waves. Equipment was lost. Some troops landed far from intended beaches, creating confusion. French coastal batteries opened fire shortly after the first landings. The new American battleship USS Massachusetts engaged the incomplete French battleship Jean Bart, still in Casablanca harbor. The naval duel demonstrated American firepower superiority, but also French willingness to resist. French fighters and bombers attacked the invasion fleet, damaging several ships. On the beaches, American troops encountered varying resistance. At some locations, French forces fought determinedly. At others, they offered token resistance before ceasing fire. The confusion stemmed from contradictory orders. Some French commanders ordered resistance. Others ordered their men to stand down. Individual initiative determined outcomes at many locations. By evening of November 8th, American forces had secured beachheads but hadn't captured Casablanca. French naval vessels sortied from the harbor, attacking landing craft and support ships before being driven back or sunk by overwhelming American firepower. The fighting at Casablanca was more intense and prolonged than planners had anticipated. Center Task Force Oran ***. General Fredendall's force landed at beaches east and west of Oran, Algeria. The plan called for rapid convergence on the port city, capturing it before French forces could organize effective resistance. Initial landings went relatively smoothly, with troops getting ashore with fewer problems than at Casablanca. However, a daring direct assault on Oran harbor proved disastrous. Two British cutters, HMS Walney and HMS Heartland, attempted to rush the harbor entrance and land American troops directly at the docks. French shore batteries and naval vessels destroyed both ships in close-range combat. The harbor assault cost hundreds of casualties and achieved nothing. On land, American troops advanced toward Oran but encountered determined French resistance at several points. French Foreign Legion units, professional soldiers with combat experience, inflicted casualties on the inexperienced Americans. Tank battles erupted as French armor engaged American forces. Air attacks by French aircraft damaged ships and strafed ground troops. By November 9th, American forces surrounded Oran but hadn't captured it. Negotiations were underway, but fighting continued sporadically. The French defenders, while outnumbered and outgunned, demonstrated professional competence that earned American respect. Eastern Task Force Algiers. The landings near Algiers, closest to Axis bases but benefiting from better diplomatic preparation, proceeded most smoothly. American troops went ashore at beaches east and west of the city, while British forces landed at more distant locations. Resistance was lighter than at Oran or Casablanca, partly due to better negotiations, and partly due to the rapid arrival of Allied forces. A coup attempt by pro-Allied French resistors in Algiers partially succeeded, causing confusion among Vichy defenders. Some French units joined the Allies immediately. Others remained loyal to Vichy and fought briefly. By the evening of November 8th, Algiers was effectively under Allied control, though formal surrender negotiations took several more hours. The relative ease of the Algiers operation validated diplomatic efforts and suggested that French forces weren't uniformly committed to resisting the Allies. However, it also demonstrated the confusion and divided loyalties plaguing French North African forces. With Allied forces ashore and French resistance weakening, diplomatic efforts intensified. The situation was complicated by the presence of Admiral François Darlan in Algiers. Darlan, commander of all Vichy French forces, was visiting when the invasion began. His presence offered opportunities. He could order all French forces in North Africa to cease fighting, but also created political problems. Darlan was a collaborationist with dubious democratic credentials. General Eisenhower faced an agonizing choice: accept Darlan's authority to end fighting quickly, or insist on working with General Giraud, the resistance-friendly French general the Allies had been cultivating. The decision had military and political dimensions. Every hour of fighting cost casualties, but collaborating with Darlan would outrage anti-fascist opinion in Britain and America. Eisenhower chose pragmatism. On November 10th, he negotiated an agreement with Darlan ordering French forces throughout North Africa to cease resistance. The Darlan deal was militarily successful. Fighting stopped at Oran on November 10th and at Casablanca on November 11th. But it generated political controversy in Allied nations, where critics condemned dealing with a Nazi collaborator. The ceasefire came none too soon. In Morocco, French forces had prepared for a final defense of Casablanca. Casualties on both sides were mounting. At Oran, street fighting threatened to devastate the port facilities the Allies needed. The agreement prevented further bloodshed between forces that would soon fight side by side against Germany. As Allied forces secured Morocco and Algeria, the Germans reacted swiftly. On November 9th, German and Italian forces began landing in Tunisia, the French North African territory closest to Sicily. Vichy French authorities in Tunisia, confused by events in Algeria and Morocco, offered minimal resistance. Within days, Axis forces controlled key Tunisian ports and airfields. The German response transformed Operation Torch's strategic situation. Instead of controlling all French North Africa, the Allies now faced an Axis-held Tunisia. The race was on. Could Allied forces, advancing from Algeria, reach Tunisia before Germans fortified it? Or would the easy conquest of Morocco and Algeria be followed by months of grinding combat in Tunisia? General Anderson's Eastern Task Force pushed toward Tunisia immediately. British and American units advanced eastward, hoping to reach Tunis and Bizerte before German reinforcements made conquest impossible. Initial progress was rapid but logistics strained. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles back to Algiers. Roads were inadequate. Rain turned dirt tracks into mud. The single-track railway couldn't handle the traffic. By late November, Allied forces were within striking distance of Tunis, but German reinforcements had arrived in strength. The 10th Panzer Division, veteran units from the Eastern Front, held strong defensive positions. The race for Tunisia had been lost. What planners hoped would be a quick campaign would instead become a 6-month battle of attrition. Operation Torch revealed numerous challenges that would shape Allied operations for the remainder of the war. American combat inexperience. The operation was America's first major offensive. Troops were enthusiastic but inexperienced. Tactical errors were common. Units became disorganized. Communications broke down. Friendly fire incidents occurred. The learning curve was steep, paid for in casualties and delays. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, American forces would receive a harsh lesson when Rommel's Afrika Korps attacked and routed the inexperienced Americans. The defeat, though temporary, demonstrated how much American forces needed to learn about modern mechanized warfare. British officers, veterans of years of fighting, sometimes viewed American troops as amateurish. American officers resented British condescension. Eisenhower had to mediate constantly between proud, competitive allies. The tension would persist throughout the war but gradually diminish as American forces gained experience and mutual respect developed. The political controversy over negotiating with Admiral Darlan overshadowed military success. Critics in Britain and America condemned the deal as unprincipled collaboration with fascism. Eisenhower defended the decision as militarily necessary and politically temporary. The assassination of Darlan on December 24, 1942, by a French resistance member ended the immediate controversy but left bitter memories. The French North African political situation proved far more complicated than planners anticipated. Multiple factions, Vichy loyalists, Gaullist resistance supporters, officers seeking to restore French honor, soldiers simply following orders, created a confusing landscape. Navigating these complexities required political skills that military commanders weren't trained for. The distances involved in North African operations stretched Allied logistics to breaking points. Morocco was 1,500 miles from the Tunisian front. Every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every ration had to travel hundreds of miles over inadequate infrastructure. Logistical challenges would plague the campaign throughout its duration. Despite challenges, Operation Torch achieved its primary objectives and had far-reaching consequences. Though not the cross-channel invasion Stalin wanted, Torch opened a second front against Germany. Axis forces had to divert troops, aircraft, and resources to North Africa. German units that might have fought in Russia instead deployed to Tunisia. The operation provided the pressure on Germany that Roosevelt had promised. Torch committed the Allies to a Mediterranean strategy. Once forces were in North Africa, the logical next steps were Sicily, then Italy. This aligned with Churchill's peripheral strategy and postponed the cross-channel invasion to 1944. Whether this was optimal remains debated by historians, but it became the Allied approach. American forces gained invaluable combat experience. The troops who landed in Morocco and Algeria in November 1942 were different soldiers by the time Tunisia fell in May 1943. They had learned tactics, logistics, combined arms operations, and amphibious assault techniques. This experience proved essential for subsequent operations. Despite tensions, Torch established patterns of Allied cooperation. Eisenhower's coalition headquarters became a model for integrated Allied command. British and American forces learned to work together, establishing relationships and procedures that would carry through D-Day and beyond. The North African campaign brought substantial French forces back into the war on the Allied side. Though politically complicated, the addition of French divisions, air squadrons, and naval units strengthened Allied power. French forces would participate significantly in the liberation of France in 1944. Operation Torch, combined with British victory at El Alamein in late October 1942, sealed the fate of Axis forces in North Africa. Caught between British forces advancing from Egypt and American forces advancing from Algeria, the Afrika Korps and Italian forces faced inevitable defeat. By May 1943, over 250,000 Axis troops surrendered in Tunisia, a loss comparable to Stalingrad. What planners hoped would be a quick conquest became a 6-month slugging match. The Tunisia campaign tested Allied forces in ways Torch's initial landings had not. German forces, commanded by General Eugen von Arnim and later reinforced by Rommel retreating from Libya, established strong defensive positions in Tunisia's mountainous terrain. They controlled the best ports and airfields. They had shorter supply lines to Sicily, and they were determined to deny the Allies complete victory in North Africa. Allied forces struggled with logistics, weather, and an enemy who understood modern warfare better than inexperienced American units. The winter of 1942-43 brought rain that turned battlefields to mud. Supply convoys bogged down. Air support was limited by weather and primitive airfield conditions. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 shocked American confidence. Rommel's forces attacked the inexperienced American II Corps, breaking through defensive lines and inflicting over 6,000 casualties. American forces retreated in disorder. The defeat, though reversed within days, revealed how much American troops needed to learn. But the Americans learned quickly. Under new leadership, General Patton took command of II Corps after Kasserine. American forces adapted. They improved tactics, better integrated armor and infantry, coordinated air and ground operations more effectively, and developed the aggressive spirit that would characterize American forces for the rest of the war. British forces, meanwhile, advanced from the east. General Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army, victorious at El Alamein, pursued Rommel across Libya into Tunisia. By March 1943, Axis forces were compressed into a shrinking perimeter in northern Tunisia, caught between British forces from the east and American-French forces from the west. The final offensive began in April 1943. Allied forces, now experienced and properly supplied, attacked Axis positions systematically. Air superiority, achieved through massive reinforcement of Allied air forces, devastated Axis supply convoys and ground forces. By May 7, British forces captured Tunis while American forces took Bizerte. Axis resistance collapsed rapidly. On May 13, 1943, the remaining 250,000 Axis troops in North Africa surrendered. The victory was complete. All of North Africa was in Allied hands. The Mediterranean's southern shore was secured. The springboard to Sicily and Italy was established. Operation Torch and the subsequent Tunisia campaign shaped the remainder of World War II in multiple ways. Amphibious operations. Torch was the first large-scale Allied amphibious operation. The techniques developed, naval gunfire support, air cover, landing craft coordination, logistics over beaches, would be refined for Sicily, Italy, and ultimately Normandy. Every subsequent amphibious operation built on lessons learned in North Africa. Coalition warfare. Managing the British-American-French coalition required political skills as much as military competence. Eisenhower emerged as a coalition commander of genius, balancing competing national interests while maintaining operational effectiveness. His performance earned him command of all Allied forces for the invasion of Europe. Strategic debate. The Mediterranean versus cross-channel debate continued throughout 1943. The North African campaign led to Sicily, July 1943, and Italy, September 1943, postponing the Normandy invasion to June 1944. Whether this delay was beneficial or costly remains debated. The Mediterranean campaigns diverted German resources and provided combat experience, but also delayed the decisive confrontation in France. American military development. The U.S. Army that fought in North Africa in late 1942 was amateurish. The army that emerged from Tunisia in May 1943 was professional. Commanders had been tested, some found wanting and replaced, others proven and promoted. Troops had learned their trade in the hardest school. The transformation from enthusiastic amateurs to competent professionals occurred in North African deserts and Tunisian mountains. Operation Torch represented a turning point in World War II, though its significance is sometimes overshadowed by other events of late 1942, Stalingrad, Midway, El Alamein. Yet Torch's importance cannot be overstated. It marked America's transition from mobilizing to fighting. American industrial might have been preparing for war since 1940, but Torch was where American military power began deploying at scale. Over 100,000 troops in November 1942 would grow to millions by 1944. The factories producing tanks, ships, and aircraft would supply not just American forces but Allied armies worldwide. It opened a new front at a critical moment. In November 1942, the war's outcome was still uncertain. Germany dominated continental Europe. The Eastern Front hung in balance. Britain fought alone in the West. Torch demonstrated that the Allies could strike back, could plan and execute complex operations, could challenge Axis dominance. It validated the peripheral strategy that would characterize Allied operations in 1943. While controversial then and debated since, the Mediterranean approach allowed Allied forces to pressure Germany while building strength for the eventual cross-channel invasion. Whether this was optimal strategy or expensive detour remains arguable, but it became the path the Allies followed. Most importantly, Torch began the process that would culminate in Allied victory. The road from Morocco's beaches to Berlin's rubble ran through Tunisia, Sicily, Italy, and France. Every step was hard-fought. Every mile cost casualties. But the journey began on those North African beaches in November 1942, when American troops went ashore for the first time, when the tide began turning, when the Allies moved from defensive to offensive. For the soldiers who landed that morning, nervous, seasick, facing hostile fire from unclear enemies, unsure if they would survive, the historical significance meant little. They focused on getting off the beach, staying alive, completing their mission. But they were making history whether they knew it or not. They were America entering the fight. They were the beginning of the end for the Axis. They were the first step on the long road to victory.